full of snow. And for some reason, it keeps following me. I can't get away from it. For those of you who aren't familiar with the Women's Bureau, I'd like to tell you a little bit about us. We were established in 1920, just a couple months before women got the right to vote. And we're one of about 28 agencies within the U.S. Department of Labor. And he had gone over the mission of the Women's Bureau. Let's see, I should be going on here. So the mission of the Women's Bureau basically is to promote the interests of working women and their families. And our vision is to empower all working women to achieve economic security. And unlike our sister agencies within the Labor Department, we do not enforce any laws. So what do? We're primarily a policy and research and advocacy organization. We're a voice for working women. Our current focus areas are fair treatment of women in the workplace, and that would include equal pay, workplace policies that support working women and their families, such as workplace flexibility, pregnancy accommodation, and earned sick leave, women's increased participation in in-demand and non-traditional occupations, and this would include transportation and construction jobs also. Now, women make up half of the workforce, but women currently make up only 15% of the transportation and material moving occupations. And according to the U.S. Department of Transportation, there are over 13 million Americans currently employed in transportation-related jobs. And nearly half of that workforce will be eligible for retirement in the next 10 years. So as the population grows, concerns relating to highway capacity, congestion, land use, and freight traffic will offer new opportunities for employment and challenges in finding qualified workers. So where will these qualified workers be found? If women are not targeted as potential employees, companies are automatically cutting their recruitment pool in half. Over the years, women have proven themselves to be competent workers in taking over, quote, men's jobs in times of necessity. And we'll go into that a little bit later. A couple of years ago, I came across an article in the New York Times by Adam Grant, who is a professor at the Wharton Business School, and Sheryl Sandberg, who, of course, you know, is the chief operating officer of Facebook. The title of the article was Speaking While Female. They have observed, and research has proved, that a woman speaking in a business setting is at a distinct disadvantage. She's either barely heard or she's judged as being too aggressive. A man saying the same thing will have heads not in agreement for appreciation of his fine ideas. And this is true for both men and women in the audience. So women are judging other women just as harshly as men would judge a woman. So unfortunately, here I am at the end of a very full day with snow outside and everybody ready to get out the door, and I'm speaking while female. So the main reason I mention this is that attitudes and perceptions influence our thinking. And even though we may think we're fair and unbiased in our interactions at work, that's not always the case. We tend to view life through a gender lens, and now we hear that most women don't want to work in the field of transportation. Actually, there is some truth in this. It's also true that most men don't work in the field of transportation. So let's look at the numbers. In 2013, almost 144 million people were employed in the civilian labor force. A little over 76 million of that number were men. And of that 76 million, a little over 7 million men worked in transportation and material moving occupations. So only 9.6% of working men worked in the transportation and moving material occupations. And when you look at the statistics for women, it comes out that 1 million women worked in transportation and material moving occupations, and that made up only 2% of the total population of working women. The important thing to remember here is that over 1 million women currently work in transportation and material moving occupations. So we can't say that women don't want these jobs. Our goal is to find out how can we let them know that they're welcome into these jobs and get them recruited when you need employees. To drill down further, of the 8,709,000 people who were working in transportation and material moving occupations, we find only 15% were women and 85% were men. And counted in that 15% of women in transportation are flight attendants, who make up 80% of that particular occupation. The Bureau of Labor Statistics category of transportation and material moving occupations includes such occupations as pilots and flight engineers, air traffic controllers, flight attendants, bus drivers, truck drivers, railroad conductors and yard masters, ship and boat captains, and laborers and freight, stock, and material movers. Many of the highway, airport, maritime, and rail occupations are included under the categories of construction. Similarly, construction occupations are only 2.8% women, while production is 27.6%. Production ranges from 59.8% women as bakers to 4.6% welders. So even with the overlap of categories, we still see a cultural or traditional trend of occupational segregation designating women's jobs and men's jobs. And as Judge Vasquez mentioned this morning, until the Equal Pay Act of 1963, women were paid only half of what men were paid, and then with the Civil Rights Act of 1964, it was illegal to exclude women from these various occupations. However, what is not usually mentioned is the fact that originally the Civil Rights Act was written to include only race, religion, national origin, and age. Women were not included in the act. There was a congressman, Howard Smith from Virginia, who was very dead set against having that law pass. And he thought that by adding sex to it, it wouldn't pass. So it was only because of his bias against women that he thought he'd stop the whole law from passing, but it did pass. Otherwise, we could still be without any civil rights. So along with the perception of whether an occupation is appropriate for men and women, there tends to be that pay scale with women's jobs paying higher salaries than what is thought of as women's work. The median earnings for bakers is only $505 a week. Welders, on the other hand, could earn $723 a week, flight attendants $767, pilots $1,845. So in spite of the long history of treating women as less able to succeed in certain occupations, women have demonstrated their competence in many of these occupations. So the first great influx of women into the workforce was during the First World War. When 1 million men entered the military, there was a demand for women to fill the vacant jobs that they left behind, and women entered the workforce in record numbers. They worked in factories and shipyards, in rail yards and civil service. They were willing to work at whatever job was needed. And a new temporary agency was formed in the War Department called Women in Industries. It was established to, quote, ensure the effective employment of women while conserving their health and welfare. unquote. After the war was over, the men returned to their civilian jobs, and the women were forced to leave their jobs to go home and take care of home and family. Women in Industry Services was then transferred to the Department of Labor as a temporary agency, and in 1920, responding to decades of lobbying by women's organizations, Congress gave Women in Industry Services permanent peacetime status as an agency within the U.S. Department of Labor to be known as the Women's Bureau. It was on June 5th, 1920, just 2.5 months before women got the right to vote with the 19th Amendment, that the Bureau was signed into law by President Woodrow Wilson. One of the earliest publications of the Women's Bureau was in 1923, and it was Bulletin number 28, which lists women's inventions. In the field of transportation, women claimed a few hundred inventions having to do with automobiles, bicycles, motorcycles, railways, traffic signals, boats, ship equipment, and aircraft. And it was a woman who came up with the idea for windshield wipers. Now we fast forward to World War II, the second great influx of women into the workforce. Desperately short of manpower, the nation again appealed for women power. And it's estimated that nearly 3 million women entered the war manufacturing industries. Again, women took over the myriad of jobs left by men who were off to war. Now, the problem was how to manage these women. I'd like to share with you an excerpt from July 1943 issue of Transportation magazine. It was written by a company called Western Properties. This was a very serious article written for male supervisors on how to hire and manage women in the workforce, as it was the common belief that women were less able to work than men. The title of the article is 11 Tips on Getting More Efficiency Out of Women Employees. And this is what it says, and I quote, "There's no longer any question whether transit companies should hire women for jobs formerly done by men. The draft and manpower shortage has settled that point. The important thing now is to select the most efficient women available and how to use them to the best advantage." And I'll read you just a few of the 11 pointers. And number 1 says, pick young married women. They usually have more of a sense of responsibility than their unmarried sisters. They're less likely to be flirtatious. They need the work or they wouldn't be doing it. And they still have the pep and interest to work hard and to deal with the public efficiently. 2, when you have to use older women, try to get ones who have worked outside the home at some time in their lives. Older women who have never contacted the public have a hard time adapting themselves and are inclined to be cantankerous and fussy. It's always well to impress upon older women the importance of friendliness and courtesy. Number 3, general experience indicates that, quote, husky girls, those who are just a little on the heavy side, are more even-tempered and efficient than their underweight sisters. Now, usually in a room of women, these get a lot of chuckles. They kind of hit home because even though they're so obsolete, in some sense, they're not. Number 4, retain a physician to give each woman a special physical examination, one covering female conditions. This step not only protects the property against the possibilities of lawsuit, but also reveals whether the employee-to-be has any female weaknesses which make her mentally or physically unfit for the job. So, all of those suggestions would be illegal today, as you've learned throughout the day and all the training you've had on the civil rights laws. But attitudes have been more difficult to change. Now, a symbol of the times was a woman named Rosie, the Riveter. She was strong, serious, and competent. She symbolized the vital importance of women to the wartime economy. And in other fields, women also demonstrated their competence and their ability to do a man's job. As the supply of male pilots began to dwindle, Nancy Love proposed the recruitment of the most qualified women pilots in the nation to assist in the air transport as civilian employees. Her proposal was adopted in the summer of 1942, and 25 female pilots were recruited to become members of the Women's Army Air Force. The women would relieve the male pilots so the men could fly during the war, and they would fly overseas during combat duty. At one time, more than 25,000 women applied for training. Only 1,830 were admitted to the program, but 25,000 women were willing to step up and pilot the planes that were needed as support services to our country. The training program began initially at Hughes Airport in Houston, and then it moved to Sweetwater, Texas. By the time the women pilots came to be known as the Women's Air Force Service Corps, and they were called by the acronym WASPs, but they were still considered civilian employees. And as civilians, they had no insurance, no death benefits, no military rank, and no veterans benefits. 38 women pilots lost their lives in the service of our country. But as a civilian organization, they didn't have any benefits. And the women talk about taking up collections among themselves in order to be able to have the bodies of their fallen pirates returned to their families for burial. It wasn't until 1997 that the WASPs were given full military status for their service and recognized as veterans. Incidentally, today women make up 20% of the new recruits for our military. With our all-volunteer Army, recruitment began falling off during the Middle Eastern wars as they went on quite long. And then the military turned its attention to women, and they responded in record numbers. So when allowed to do so, women can and do contribute to our economy. And they're not afraid of hard work. And we are still working to change cultural and traditional attitudes of the past. We still hear that women won't work in transportation. In fact, I heard that a couple times today in talking to other women. They say they're afraid of physically demanding and hands-on jobs where they might get dirty, and women are not strong enough to do the job. But consider nursing, a predominantly women's work. And when you think about what nurses do, it's a job that is physically demanding. Think about moving and positioning bodies, and these bodies today weigh often over 200 pounds. Many hospitals require 12-hour shifts. Most of the time is spent on your feet, and the work must continue to be done during the night and during catastrophic weather conditions. Nursing is not something that is for the faint of heart. It is a very demanding, physically demanding occupation. So nursing continues to be a profession of choice for women, possibly because it is one of the highest occupations that welcomes women. Last year, the Women's Bureau held a number of webinars and roundtables that focused on exploring challenges and increasing opportunities for women considering entering transportation careers. A number of organizations participated in these events, including government, education, private employers, and consulting firms. Representatives in aviation, railway, highway industries also participated in a number of our events. The Women's Bureau worked closely with the Department of Transportation to conduct research to identify barriers, trends, employment outlook, and promising practices for women in the transportation industry, with the goal of reducing barriers inhibiting and preventing women's participation. We found that women and girls face a lack of positive exposure to the industry, a lack of schedule flexibility and other family-friendly policies, and a lack of role models and career development activities. We conducted a session with young women in civil engineering program at the University of Texas in San Antonio, and all of the young women happened to be of Hispanic origin. They told us that at first they were not welcome in the classes. They had to prove that they were serious and competent before being accepted by their male peers. And at first they were overlooked and their comments disregarded by their professors. They were speaking while female. But they loved engineering and they persevered. We were surprised to find that the person most influential in their choice of career was their father. Most of their fathers worked in some area of construction, often as a laborer. These fathers involved their daughters in their work and encouraged them to go to college so they could work in the industry and earn a good wage. They also expressed their love for the work, and they are so glad and thankful that their fathers had that faith in them in order to encourage them. We conducted another roundtable with professional women who were members of Women's Transportation Seminar, and they worked for various private companies or city government in some aspect of transportation. When they first were on the job, they said they had to deal with various forms of hazing and sexual harassment, but they were fortunate in finding a mentor, usually a male, who helped them deal with the culture. They persevered. They said that the transportation culture is slowly changing to be more welcoming to women, and that it is in fact the men who are responsible for making these changes. So the U.S. Department of Labor has identified 5 major barriers that women face in apprenticeships and non-traditional occupations, and the first barrier is a lack of information. The women simply do not know about the opportunities that are available in non-traditional occupations, nor the prerequisites, benefits, and working conditions associated with them. They also don't know about the salaries. We were asked by a construction company to help them recruit women for laborer jobs. And when I tried to find out what the pay was, they would only say they pay a competitive salary. But if you're not familiar with the industry, a competitive salary doesn't mean anything. Is that minimum wage? Is it $10 an hour, 15, 20? We had absolutely no idea. And, excuse me, knowing what to expect in salary can make a big difference in attracting women to the profession. It's also a difficult work culture. Women who do decide to pursue a career in a skilled trade often find the male-dominated work difficult to deal with. Women working in traditionally male occupations may face issues like sexual harassment, gender discrimination, and isolation on the job. So it's always a good action to hire at least 2 women if you're going to look at having women in a certain area. Other barriers are a lack of family support, a lack of basic skills. Many of the women and young girls have not been exposed to the trades, and this is where the young women in civil engineering at the University in San Antonio had their fathers to provide them with that experience. There's also a lack of reliable transportation and tools, and women entering in a laborer position, low income, may be in a position not to have an automobile that's reliable or the tools that are needed to do the job. So we can call these barriers, or we can look at them as challenges. And many low-income women are faced with similar challenges. And I'd like to introduce you to one who made a success out of it. This is Elisa Matthews, and she worked at Northrop Grumman. She was the overall outstanding apprentice for her welding graduating class at Northrop Grumman Shipbuilding in New Orleans in 2009. And that year, they actually had 30% of their class female. She began her career at Northrop Grumman as a 38-year-old single mother who thought she was out of options but was willing to try any job. In her own words, she says, "I never imagined 3 years ago, as I drove the 120 miles from Macomb, Mississippi to get here, that I would be part of a team of people who worked so hard to build the vessels that the brave men and women of our military will live on and work on. When I clock in each day, I realize how important my job is. I must say when I first started, I would hear a lot of, 'You can't do this,' or 'You won't be able to achieve that,' from people who were supposed to be my friends. What those people didn't know was that I'm not a quitter. It hasn't been easy. It takes a lot of commitment, dedication, and hard work to prove those naysayers wrong, but it was worth it." And she's just another example of a woman excelling at what was thought of as a man's job. So how do you recruit women and retain them in transportation jobs? There is a WANTO grant. It stands for Women in Apprenticeship and Non-Traditional Occupations. And the Women's Bureau has worked with the Employment and Training Administration of the Department of Labor to encourage the employment of women in non-traditional occupations and apprenticeships. While the grants have been relatively small, the recipients have devised programs that achieve great results. Organizations receiving WANTO grants have established pre-apprenticeship programs, helped employers and unions establish apprenticeship programs, recruit women, and help overcome barriers to women in non-traditional jobs. Oregon Tradeswomen has a very successful recruiting program to bring women into their apprenticeships and the trades. The organization is located in Portland, a city with a population less than 600,000, much smaller than the Oklahoma City metropolitan area. What is significant is that they have 900 women come through their door annually to explore trades careers. They know how to get the women's attention. Unfortunately, they have the capacity to serve only 100 women a year, and last year, 83 women graduated from the pre-apprenticeship program. 47 became apprentices, 13 work as commercial construction helpers, 9 went into manufacturing and warehouse work, and 9 to residential construction. Oregon Tradeswomen has demonstrated that when women hear that they're welcome in non-traditional jobs and that the job pays a good wage, they want the work. And ideally, girls should be introduced to non-traditional career information throughout their K through 12 years. But until this happens, pre-apprenticeship programs can be effective for outreach and the recruitment of women. Did we change? Sorry. On October 1st of last year, the Women's Bureau hosted a webinar called Paving the Way for Women in Construction, Creating Systems and Supports That Work. The webinar was designed to explore ways to increase women's participation, retention, and success in the construction industry, and over 300 people participated in the webinar, with representatives from state and local government, educational institutions, nonprofits, and women's organizations, and women construction workers themselves. On this webinar, the Institute for Women's Policy Research reported on their 2013 Tradeswomen Survey, where they found that fewer than 2% of respondents learned about opportunities in the trades from a high school counselor or from a job center counselor. And it has been happening that job centers tend to direct women to traditionally female occupations. They also found that isolation, harassment, discrimination continue to be a problem, with 31% reporting that they experience sexual harassment on the job, 32% experienced racial harassment or discrimination, and 30% age discrimination. So while these are unacceptable percentages, almost 70% of the women that they surveyed said they did not experience any harassment or discrimination. And that's very encouraging. So these are probably women working at companies like the ones you work at. Another positive note, it's also reported that women in construction face a smaller wage gap than women overall. So once the women have the jobs, the companies are being more fair to them than most companies are in other occupations. So when you pay a good wage and you want to state your starting salary in real numbers, and women will look at the numbers and really consider your jobs. There is the aspect of women not negotiating their beginning salaries, and this is fairly well known that when a woman applies for a job, whatever salary is told to her, she's apt to take it, whereas a man will try to bump it up and try to negotiate. This is something that women need to be trained to do, and it has not really been accomplished yet. Wider opportunities for women address the need for expanded exposure in the classroom and pre-apprenticeship programs. And while these are longer-term strategies for immediate recruitment of women, she says to go where the women are, connect to activities, institutions, and organizations that are serving women. One company had success in posting job announcements for women at laundromats. And there are people who feel it's degrading to have to post jobs in places like laundromats and childcare centers. But if these women are unemployed and they have never worked in that particular field, how are you going to reach them and let them know that you really want them to work for you? Get the attention of women by providing information on benefits and the advantages of your non-traditional jobs. Use materials that appeal directly to women and feature women working in non-traditional jobs in your literature and on your website. And some of the PowerPoints that we saw today, on the screen it was predominantly all men and very few pictures of women, which is kind of a turnoff that women will say, they don't really want women there. In your ads, address women specifically in the headline, and remember that people need to hear and see a message more than once in order to respond to it. It also helps to have a woman recruiter. And we conducted a webinar on women in transportation together with Women's Transportation Seminar. The webinar was called Women Moving America, Women in Transportation, Careers, Obstacles, and Opportunities. Laura Weiss, Associate Vice President at ACOM in Dallas, was one of the presenters. Women represent over 1/3 of their workforce. They have a global women's council, a women's leadership collective for mentoring, career development, and networking. And the women's groups within the company help with the retention once women are hired. Laura spoke about highway construction. We also had presenters from Kansas City addressing rail, and Chicago addressed aviation. Did you know that 31 airports are run by women directors or acting directors, including some of the largest in the world? Women are in charge of the airports in Los Angeles, Chicago, Phoenix, Denver, Salt Lake City, and St. Louis. Women's professional associations are very helpful in increasing the number of women who work in transportation and construction. Women's Transportation Seminar was founded in 1977 and is dedicated to building the future of transportation through global advancement of women. It has more than 5,000 members, both women and men, and it helps women find opportunities and recognition in the transportation industry. Women's Transportation Seminar is an unlikely name for an association, but when it began, women couldn't get subsidized for this association membership unless it was strictly educational, so the name seminar was used to reinforce the educational aspect of their association. They provide mentoring, support, networking opportunities to women working in the various transportation fields. And they also reach out to high schools and colleges to interest young women in pursuing these careers. Another professional association is the National Association of Women in Construction. They began in the 1950s, and they're headquartered close by in Fort Worth. Neither association has a chapter in Oklahoma, but if any one of you is interested in beginning a chapter, I can put you in touch with the right person so you can proceed and start working to bring women together in Oklahoma to advance women. There are other professional organizations such as Women in Aviation, Women in Trucking, that could be used for recruiting women. And you also need to check the U.S. Department of Transportation's website for their programs that assist in recruiting women. The Women's Bureau will be developing a transportation toolkit to provide women with information about transportation occupations. We're also establishing an online clearinghouse. The Women's Bureau will make a clearinghouse that will be central, comprehensive repository of federal resources and tools related to working women. A section will be devoted to women in non-traditional occupations, specifically those of construction, transportation, and protective services. It will have the latest information on access to these occupations, promising industry practices, employment and training, relevant federal and state legislation, mega projects, and research and data. The clearinghouse is for use by everyone who is interested in women in transportation, including apprenticeships, employers, unions, and women themselves. I began speaking about attitudes and perceptions and assigned gender roles. These influence our actions even though we consciously do not think we are biased, and we don't really want to be biased. And a clear example of this was demonstrated by orchestras. In the late 1970s, the top 5 orchestras in the United States had fewer than 5% women. It wasn't until 1980 that any of these top orchestras had 10% women, and by 1997 they were up to 25% women. Today, the top 250 orchestras in the United States are 50% women. In fact, St. Louis, women have outnumbered the men in their orchestra. So they went from 5% to 50%. And what was the source of this change? Have they added jobs? No. The size of the orchestras didn't change. Have they focused on work that appeals to women? No. The types of jobs did not change. The only change that took place was using blind auditions. In the 1970s and 80s, orchestras began using blind auditions, and that is, candidates were on a stage behind a screen, and they would play for recruiters who could not see them. There was no way to tell if the musician was male or female. Even when the screen is only used in the preliminary round, researchers determined that this step alone makes it 50% more likely that women will advance to the finals. Then, as more women were hired, there has also been an increase in the number of women applying for the jobs when they saw that the jobs were available to them. So, of course, blind auditions cannot be translated directly to transportation careers, but we can remove gender bias, first by being aware of it, and then working to promote these careers to girls and young women, and hiring the best person for the job, and then providing a non-hostile work environment. So in summary, remember that women make up almost half the workforce. Over 13 million Americans work in transportation. Nearly half of these people will be retiring within the next 10 years. Women will make up a significant pool for recruitment. The employment of women is not just a women's issue, it's a family issue. Most women work because families depend on their contributions to the household income. In the majority of families, both parents work. Only 18% of families are made up of a working father and a stay-at-home mother. And today's workforce is older, more ethnically and racially diverse, and more women are working for pay than ever before. So, when we're looking at who our workforce is going to be, in Texas right now, Texas, as of the last census, became the fourth majority-minority state in the nation, along with Hawaii, Florida, and California. There are more minorities in Texas than there are non-Hispanic whites. This is a trend that is going throughout the country. Another interesting fact is that only 30% of children under 5 in our country are non-Hispanic white. So the other 70% of children would be of a racial minority or an ethnic minority. And this is our workforce of the future, so we have to start thinking about biases and who do we want to work for us and how we want to treat them. So in closing, I want to say that I thank you very much for staying, even though it's snowing. And our intent is not to replace men at work. We just want women to have a fair chance. And when you're hiring, just remember that sometimes the best man for a job is a woman. Thank you very much. Oh, we had our contact information. There it is. The PowerPoint information is not on the flash drive that you got, but if anybody wants it, just contact me and I'll send you the information. Thank you.